From Uriah Hall totally crumbling before his elite competition, to Conor McGregor being gloriously humbled by Khabib Nurmagomedov, these are the UFC fighters who thought they were great but weren't. Starting with Uriah Hall, you know how some things work so well on paper, but then you put them to the test in the real world. And well, it's so disappointing you can't understand what went wrong. Well, an accurate example of such a case is Uriah. When this guy burst onto the scene, he was all power. He was athletic, agile, and could strike like no one you've ever seen. Hall was so good, actually, he could have followed in Anderson Silva's footsteps. Back in 2013, Uriah absolutely dominated his run on The Ultimate Fighter. Even Chael Sonnen had him pegged as a middleweight contender. So when Prime Time took on the UFC, his performance was totally worthy of his nickname. With great skill, Hall proved that maybe there was truth to all the hype surrounding him. And when he got an impressive TKO victory against the very skilled Gegard Mousasi, the fans began believing in him even more. But then it all began going downhill, and the lack of consistency got to Uriah. He had a hard time facing off against the more experienced competition. The loss against Kelvin Gastelum was hard to watch, but fans still held on. Unfortunately, it was followed by more disappointment against John Howard. He had some good moments later, like his win against Anderson Silva in 2020, but Hall never lived up to the hype he once had. Next, it's Eric Silva, who couldn't make the cut. It was 2011 when Silva, aka the Fierce Tiger, emerged under the shining lights of the UFC, and he was already at pro status with a 12-1 record. Careful curiosity mixed with excitement turned into full-on hype after his first 3 fights. First, Silva managed a 40-second stoppage win over Luis Ramos. Next, he took a loss when he was disqualified for using illegal strikes, but that just made him seem even more tiger-like. Following that, Eric dominated his toughest competition, Charlie Brenneman. Just when he'd gotten everyone all riled up, Silva began kinda losing it. After his 3rd victory, he lost to John Fitch, the former title challenger. Sure, he bagged Fight of the Night, but it was still a loss, and sadly, it was the first of many to come. For the hype train that welcomed him into the UFC, the best Silva put up was a 2-win streak. He stuck around in the organization until 2017. But when he wrapped up promotions, he did so with a disappointing 7-8 record in the Octagon. Now, this next fighter burned out just as brightly as he first emerged. I'm talking about Gilbert Melendez. El Nino began his time in the UFC with a great track record. He was a 2-time Strikeforce champion and was also a former WEC champion. And his performance in both these organizations had been so exemplary that everyone wanted him to take on the biggest stage in sports, the UFC. Ability-wise also, this fighter was a goldmine. He was a technical striker, with boxing skills that even the best in the game could appreciate. Additionally, Gilbert was a remarkable grappler. He'd earned a BJJ black belt under Cesar Gracie, the legend. Now, if that ain't the stuff that hype dreams are made of. In fact, everybody had such high hopes from the guy that he immediately entered the UFC lightweight title fight opposite Benson Henderson. True, El Nino was totally in warrior form for that bout, and his performance was stunning, but he lost a split decision. But he still had fire in his fight, and so he instantly bounced back by claiming a victory over Diego Sanchez. Looking back, that was as good as it was gonna get for the guy because his career quickly went into freefall after that fight. Melendez just couldn't hack it, and he had a 5-fight losing streak. It was unbelievable to see a Strikeforce champ bow out with a disappointing 1-6 record in the UFC. Talking about disappointing, this next UFC fighter who just didn't know when to give up, Kamaru Usman. Now, Usman was the reigning welterweight champ for a respectable amount of time. Plus, he was considered one of UFC's top pound-for-pound combatants. But all of that changed at UFC 278 when Leon Edwards got the best of him. And it wasn't a pretty sight. In the final minute of the match, Edwards thrust a head kick at Kamaru. And just like that, the legend of Usman dissipated. However, it must have hit really hard, because Kamaru just couldn't believe he'd been beaten. Instead, Usman began preparing to reclaim his title from Leon at UFC 286. His plan was simple. He wanted to remind Edwards what was going on before that unforgettable kick. Speaking on the Pivot podcast, he said that it was going to be more difficult this time around, because the kick had made Leon believe that he was the one who had the upper edge. Usman's plan was to remind Rocky that he'd been taking his soul, and that he was going to do it again. Now, when the day to do all that arrived, The Nigerian Nightmare was simply no match for the sheer prowess of Edwards. The entire O2 Arena in London watched as Rocky kept the welterweight championship, while Kamaru ate his words. Also, while on the subject of fighters who spoke too soon, here's another one. Betch Correa. For this one, I'm gonna have to draw your attention first to Ronda Rousey. Rousey was the trailblazer who first made Dana White believe that UFC was very much a place for women. Her career, for the most part, was drama-free. Now, as Ronda was racking up impressive stats, Betch was swiftly going through many of Rousey's training partners. After doing so, Correa aka Pitbull had a thing or two to say about her. All through their pre-fight obligations, Betch's words against her opponent cut deep and were super personal. She talked about Ronda's father took his own life and said that Rowdy wasn't a superhero, and she actually needed to take care of herself because, sure, she's being cheered on as she wins, but Correa didn't believe she was worth the hype that surrounded her. Betch even made a nasty joke about how Ronda might go down the same path as her dad. Rowdy didn't let any of that talk slide, and she absolutely obliterated Correa when the two had the face-off. Rousey cemented herself as a top-notch fighter and dispatched Betch 34 seconds into the first round of their fight. Now this next fighter got a physics lesson as he hurled himself headfirst into an immovable object by the name of Kamaru. Tyron Woodley. For around 3 years, Woodley had the top position in UFC's welterweight pecking order. And y'all, he had great momentum. After all, you don't get called the chosen one for nothing. Tyron had brilliant wrestling skills and could jack jaws like he was made to do just that. But then came UFC 235, and he was supposed to go up against Kamaru Usman. Leading up to the match, Tyron was totally relaxed. He thought that his opponent couldn't do anything to beat him. Tyron thought there was nothing special in Usman that'd make him believe he had to be afraid. Well, Kamaru took a hammer to Tyron's confidence when the two met in the octagon. It took Usman 5 rounds to prove that Woodley hadn't sized him up accurately at all. It all works in cycles, I guess, because Usman kinda went through the same thing too. Moving on, this next miscalculated hype train came from the master himself, Conor McGregor. The Notorious is no stranger to controversy. He's been at the heart of his own hype machine for a long time, and boy does he love playing the game. After the two had been going at each other for about 2 years, McGregor and Nurmagomedov finally got the chance to fight it out. As per Conor, he came back to get rid of a little rat. Ever since he stormed UFC 223 Media Day to get back at Khabib for reproaching his teammate Artyom Lobov, things continued to get chaotic between the two champs. That whole episode ended with Conor throwing a dolly through a bus window, getting arrested, and putting up a $50,000 bail to walk out of the disaster. The presser for the match was considered the darkest in the history of the UFC by Dana. When the pair first got together after that bus incident, Conor called Khabib a dead man walking. He maintained that the Russian was a phony, but the Eagle took UFC 229 as an opportunity to show the sort of fighting that had gotten him his undefeated status. With a 27-0 record to his name, Khabib quickly submitted McGregor by the 4th round. But with these two, the rivalry had gone way too deep, and Nurmagomedov wasn't satisfied with beating Conor only. Instead, more violence ensued as he glided through the crowd to go for Conor's training partner. So, from Conor McGregor being gloriously humbled by Khabib Nurmagomedov to Uriah Hall totally crumbling before his elite competition, these were the UFC fighters who thought they were great but weren't.